Hello everyone, I'm joined today by a lecturer in architecture at the University of Auckland, Dr. Karamia Muller. Is that the correct pronunciation of your name?
Yes, Karamia, yes.
Karamia Muller, that's
yes,
the one.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing your surname is not from Pacific Island origin.
No, but it's part of a Pacific colonial history.
Right.
My great-grandfather is Swiss German, and he came down on a kind of exploratory, he's a bit of an adventurer, and he worked at various colonial enterprises across the Pacific, in I think maybe in the 1830s sort of time, and then he ended up settling in Tonga and meeting a Samoan woman who he consequently married. And began a family, and I come from that line.
I should say as well, you are, as far as we know, the first Samoan woman to get a PhD in architecture. Is that right?
Yes, I am, as we know. It's a very small field, so there hasn't been anybody else who's Samoan and a woman who's that anyone's come across. So as far as we know, and definitely the first one from the University of Auckland.
And what was your PhD in, if you don't mind me asking?
Not at all. It was on how diaspora, Samoan diaspora, that is like Samoan communities and people who are spread across the world, because Samoans have a history of migrating. There's quite large communities in LA, as well as New Zealand, and then across Australia as well. And it's about how they, in the event of not having geographical space, like a Samoa, like the motherland so close, how their currently contemporary Samoans are thinking or at practicing ritual ceremonies that used to require space, how they're doing that across the digital realm. So it is a bit of a departure from the built realm, but it sort of takes principles of traditional architecture and thinks about whether or not those principles persist in digital space.
And is there an increasing use of digital technologies in Samoan and Pacific architecture?
Well, I guess I make the case that, in my doctorate, I make the case that initially Samoan creative practices more broadly were sort of subjected to a disciplinary kind of splitting. So because they were observed by anthropologists and then later architects, and that, sort of thinking about how to make space was sort of very much thought of through a Western lens. So the ways that space was sort of understood, or architecture was understood, was very Western. And so I guess I make the case that it's actually more, architecture is a more spatialized practice within Samoan worldview. And therefore, I guess, I've sort of forgotten your question.
How much is digital sort of having an influence? Because we always think of digital, of the sort of technologies being very part of the London scene and American scene.
Yes.
Whereas there's a kind of a blindness in the rest of the world to the existence of an architectural world.
Yeah.
Especially around the Pacific
that.
Islands and beyond that at all, even in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So is it something that's seeping over from the US and from the UK and Europe?
Well, I actually make the case that rather than seeping over, Pacific or Pacific diaspora, Samoan diaspora as well, underneath that umbrella, actually always have their kind of spatial practices, and they're just applying them in digital ways and digital platforms. So it's less that, and sort of to kind of carry on that conversation that I had earlier that dialogue I had earlier was that this idea of the way of practicing architecture, Western sense, may not be applicable. So they already have a kind of spatial practice, and that's just being sort of, that's finding its own translation through digital platforms, social media platforms, and other sort of forms of exchange online.
And how does the spatial practice of Samoan and Pacific architecture differ to that of New Zealand or the Western world or European architecture, do you think?
Well, we probably, obviously the Pacific is like made up of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, and Samoan, sort of the Samoan diaspora, we're Polynesian, whereas Micronesia and Melanesian have different building traditions. Although arguably, it's probably best not to only use those kind of those ways of distinguishing the difference architecturally. But so when you talk about New Zealand, we do have similarities that are Polynesian. Like, for example, we do have a sense of relationships being really important, spaces that sort of single cell, arguably, but single cell in a way that rituals and ceremonies and processes can take place in a very indigenous way, a known way, and a socio-culturally sanctioned way by people and communities within those single cell spaces. So that is something that's runs through Polynesian architecture, but also Micronesian and Melanesian. But there's also, so aspects, obviously timber construction in Māori architecture is quite different from the construction in Samoa and so on and so forth. And even between Samoa and Tonga, there's quite different ways of understanding space as well as constructing. So, which is to say, it really depends on the region. There's actually, within the broader oceanic or Pacific region, even within the nation states, there's very different ways of constructing, and definitely with Samoa and the kind of Pacific, as we sort of think about Fiji, Samoa and Tonga, we think about more fale construction, which is sort of different places have different ways of constructing it, but it's sort of an open pavilion with a roof and different lashing techniques to bring the different timber members together.
Are those sort of cultural differences that have resulted in that, or is this sort of a geographical influence on it as well in terms of the plants or the trees that are available?
Yes. I mean, traditional architecture, there's less we think about. So there's a few ways to kind of come at it or think about it. One's formally, one is materially. So thinking about construction and techniques and tectonics. And then there's a kind of social or relational way of thinking about it. In terms of the relational way, yes. In traditional Samoan architecture, there's two different types of fale, and they have the way the posts are constructed or placed have a kind of significance within governance. So particular members sit in particular spaces. And then, and I'm less familiar with Tongan architecture, but there's kind of there is a way of thinking about placement and use of tools and use of materials. And again, in Māori architecture, it's similar, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me about the meeting house was having the columns straight down the middle of what you would think would be like an open, multifunctioning space. So, so does that actually have an influence in how they use the space? And is that a deliberate act rather than just a practical thing?
Yes, it's a deliberate act. And I think it's useful to think of it as a deliberate act because it sort of moves it away from it. It's useful to think about it as a deliberate act because then we can really take into account how building is, the kind of act of building and architecture is really woven into larger kind of cultural understanding or an indigenous way of knowing how to build or a building. And I think it also allows for more nuanced sort of understanding.
Yeah, it's such a inversion of this classic sort of Western idea of a church with sort of a central aisle or central passageway that's framed on either side. You have the meeting house where the columns are literally right in the middle, and it seems very, from an architectural point of view, unnatural in a way. But then it's interesting to see how that might influence how the space is used. And as you're saying, is there a social hierarchy you mentioned of where people sit in relation to that.
Yes, there is. And that kind of, that's negotiated across various ceremonies and rituals or proceedings, and depending on what the proceeding's for. So those sorts of things are sort of really negotiated in the time space of that moment. I think, one of the things that sort of various architectural theorists think about is how, in sort of the oceanic way of thinking about things, space is open and relational, so it's in between, whereas within the Western framework it's always contained and requires walls to contain it, and that being a kind of paradigmatic shift in thinking. So to kind of, I guess, maybe it requires a shift to understand why something that sort of seemed counterintuitive to an arrangement of space, for example, putting columns down the middle, or how that actually makes a lot of sense, or in fact is very central, or is in keeping with value systems, different value systems for a whole different worldview.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of the sort of difference in the way Maori and Western ideas treat the land ownership as well.
Yes.
About sort of obviously the colonialists came in and started dividing everything up and putting fences up and saying this is my bit and this is your bit and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess the indigenous attitude is that more communal attitude of no one owns the land and everyone owns the land and it's all part of the same thing. So do you think that relates to the way that oceanic people treat architecture as well, and architectural space?
I mean, I don't know if that, I mean, the case has been made that we're guardians for the land, or that people see themselves as like kaitiaki, which is guardians of the land. So we don't necessarily have ownership, but I don't know how much of a case has been made for that being, it has been made. Because in Māori architecture, the sort of ancestors are the building. They're embodied by the building. So tupuna take care of the land. So there's no discrete ways of thinking about the world. Ancestors are part of a building, and that building is part of the land, and we're kind of all in a continuum of thinking about a continuum of guardianship. So in that way, yes, I guess it's understood. It's probably, I don't know if in terms of more broader Oceania, I don't know if that case has been made. Certainly there's been sort of a lot of kind of discourse around whether or not the whale was an upturned canoe, or a canoe that's been flipped over, or whether it was always that shape. And then there's always also been various perspectives on whether or not it's useful to think about that. What's clear is that there's definitely a sort of language sharing, an architectural language sharing between maritime construction and building construction. So openness and caring for the land and its relationship to the whale. I don't know of any argument that's been made for that, but it's certainly a case has been made for a sense of being in connection with the greater, I guess, the world, the cosmos, and architecture. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course you're here teaching many New Zealander students how to be architects.
Yeah.
How does Indigenous, Oceanic and Maori architecture influence the students here in terms of their work, in terms of their philosophy, and especially, given the name of this podcast, the theory behind what it is that they're doing architecturally? Well,
I mean, in several ways. At a kind of construction level, we're very interested in timber construction. We have a lot of leading kind of practices and researchers here who specialise in timber construction. So there's that aspect. At a architectural historian level, cultural and heritage level, there's different, that brings with it a different, also an attitude or approach to what we might think about when we think about heritage and conservation and issues around that, whether or not, some Indigenous practitioners think things should have their lifespan, and that lifespan should be honoured. And when it's time for a building to sort of no longer be, then it's time. So, whether or not Western understandings of conservation adhere to that is something that's being, I guess, negotiated still. In theory sort of does an interesting thing when it comes into contact with practice, and that it's sometimes actually down to legislative kind of measures at that level. In terms of design studio or design practices, we have ideas about biculturalism and bicultural design, and that's, we have the Treaty of Waitangi here. So that's a kind of legal and formal document which that governs, sort of all of Aotearoa in New Zealand, how we might think in and around a kind of future of a country that has colonialism, and how we might sort of honour kind of Māori people and communities. So there are those sorts of aspects which still feel like they have a lot of theoretical space for designers to think in and around. So students often take on these kind of ideas and often just play with them. So I guess I would sort of in a large way just say it's more expansionary. It seems to be an expansion of their thinking theoretically, and that's how I tend to see it being applied. A way of thinking, like almost having another sort of not taking it as a given. The Western framework's the only framework to consider design issue. Yeah.
And do you think that expansionist view is becoming more prominent in New Zealand architectural education recently? Like, is there sort of a shift of attitudes in any way over the last few years or decades about how Maori architecture is treated?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, part of that is we're having more Indigenous practitioners graduate. We're having more Māori and Pacific graduates from schools, and they're going on to shape the profession. We also have, iwi are also now, with various settlements, iwi are now interested in centering their graduates at projects and significant projects. So that's also a motivating factor for the profession to sort of take it more seriously, more broadly. But also, I think there's also where sort of there's a sense, for example, the New Zealand Institute of Architects has just been given a name. Of course, and now it escapes me, but they've been given a Māori name. So there's a sort of cultural uptake and consciousness around what a multicultural future for the country might look like in terms of the built realm. And this also we're coming to a time where we're hitting the 150 year mark for a lot of significant buildings. So this conversation about how we think about the future of the built realm is seeing a resurgence as well.
Yeah. Well, it's a sort of a strange comparison to compare Western architecture with Maori architecture, given you wouldn't have you haven't in the past had like a Maori railway station or a Maori Parliament building or a Maori concert hall or anything like that. But it is this sort of confined to almost vernacular architecture in a very restrictive way in a lot of people's mindsets. So do you think there's potential for expanding the sort of the scope of what Maori architecture actually is in terms of the program, just of sorts of buildings that you actually get to build?
Yeah, I think so. Of course. I mean, I saw a master's project that thought about a community centre, housing, and I see these routinely using through a Te Ao Māori worldview just last year, and I've seen multiple of those. So completed by a Māori student who was sort of really invested in seeing these kind of programmatic, not necessarily understood by people who are non-Māori as, not programmatically understood as Māori per se, but I think it's very much, I think everyone's interested in that. I could be wrong. I hope not. But I think there's great interest, and I think definitely as we see more Indigenous practitioners graduate or graduates, I think we're going to see what that looks like to them on their terms, which I think is where the real sort of where that kind of shift is happening.
Yeah. Do you think that having been a colonized, that's the word I'm looking for, colonized country, that there's this almost technological binary between the westernized sort of large high-tech advanced sort of architecture and projects, and then almost as a reaction against that, there's almost a deliberate vernacularization or aversion to necessarily the high tech by maybe the Maori community, as almost just to deliberately draw a contrast and make a distinction of itself versus the westernized culture. And does that exist at all, do you think? And has it held back Maori architecture maybe?
Not that I've observed. In fact, all the Māori graduates I've seen have been very future focused, and that has been felt part of their own kaupapa, or Māori processes, is to be innovative, is to be technologically minded, is to keep value systems, Māori value systems or Indigenous value systems. I'm also not Māori, so I can't really speak. All I can say is what I've observed. So it's a thing of keeping values at the centre of the design, but not necessarily a sort of, I haven't at all actually seen, in fact, quite the opposite, seen sort of a real interest in technologies and how technologies may promote equitable, greater equity for Māori. That's actually what I've more observed. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's been interesting travelling around, seeing the sort of the integration or beginnings of integration, either on old buildings or new buildings, of Maori and Indigenous designs within contemporary architecture, or even sort of post-war architecture, where you see these sort of precast concrete panels with the certain patterns in and this kind of thing. And there's just hints amongst all of the sort of westernized contemporary architecture of that influence. So what do you think is the sort of the appropriate level of either separation or integration between those kind of two architectural worlds?
There's different sort of perspectives on that. One, if some of the work is not completed if it's been appropriated, say, if the kind of patternization has been appropriated by a non-Indigenous practitioner to sort of, I guess, patternize a building, there's a bit of discourse around whether or not that has a kind of future for meaningfully thinking about Indigenous architecture. There's a bit of discourse and also a bit of sort of skepticism, healthy skepticism around whether or not that's the way forward for meaningfully thinking about Indigenous design principles. So I think it's really a case by case thing. I think a different argument can be made for different contexts and different spaces, but it is becoming clear that Māori and Pacific people wish to be at the centre of the design process for buildings that concern their built world, their built realm, and their communities and their people. So it's less about, I think, a formal thing for Indigenous practitioners. I think it's more about a holistic kind of thinking when it comes to how a building might materialize Indigenous values and perspectives or narratives.
Yeah, I guess it's a difficult sort of side to approach it from if you're not a member of the Indigenous community and you're trying to sort of show that you value that in your design work that you're doing.
Yes.
You're sort of kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't, in a way that you're trying to sort of incorporate something that you value, that you generally want to take to consideration of, but then if you do, you're then accused of culturally appropriating.
Yes.
So,
I mean, to answer that question for the kind of, because I'm conscientious that response elicits sort of like, well, what can we do if you're not Indigenous? And I think kind of keeping those conversations open is really great. And I think that's the kind of work that's kind of been going on. And that's been, for example, realizing that New Zealand Institute of Architecture architects might need, should have a Māori name. It's sort of that thing of working past those sort of anxieties, I think, and staying open to those that dialogue, I think is quite interesting. It's an interesting thing that's happening in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned the word patternization as well, because I was down in Christchurch for a fair while and seeing all the new buildings going up there, obviously since the earthquakes, that a lot of them are these sort of what I always call bad versions of pseudo-modernism, that have been sort of, someone's taken a grasshopper script or something and put a pattern on that's then in like etched into the glass or like engraved in the wood or the stonework or something like that. But that's as far as it goes. It's sort of a shallow interpretation. So do you think there's a tension between the theory, the modern sort of modernist or the contemporary theory of Western architecture and the theory that Maori architecture has in terms of the community side of it as well, and the way that space is presented architecturally?
Yes, I think there is a tension, but I also think that's what theory's always been a tension. Has tensions in it. It requires you a bit of risk because it's sort of a premise rather than an actual fact. So I think, well, for me, I think that's why it makes it a sort of interesting thing, and also sort of it's not to say that all risk is worthwhile. It's to say that the kind of risk in buildings and theoretically considering these expressions is quite it's a good thing to do, but it's difficult to say whether or not, I think can only speak from my perspective, but for some people patternization is incredibly meaningful, and then for others they might feel like it wasn't so it's not spatial enough, it's not within the building's DNA. So it's really it's clear that those sorts of things are still being sort of negotiated in the built realm.
And is there one thing I haven't really noticed much of, I don't know if it exists at all, is an Indigenous sort of residential architecture around? Because you see meeting houses around, and you see contemporary buildings that have a patternization or something like that. But I haven't seen anything that is immediately obvious as Indigenous vernacular architecture or housing, rather than the sort of hangover from colonial sort of housing.
Yeah.
So does that exist? And if so, what's it look like effectively?
Urban marae exist, and that's urban marae exist, and it's sort of probably more formally more recognisable as traditional Māori architecture, and there is housing within, a sense of dwelling, both permanent and temporary, within some urban marae. So yeah, I mean, whether or not there's kind of like bungalows, for want of a better word, like a kind of typology, no, not as yet. Although there are some interesting conversations within the housing New Zealand landscape, about how to think about intergenerational living, which is how Indigenous people tend to, or sort of still saying they would like, and still saying it's how they live, or definitely for Pacific communities.
Would that have a knock-on effects on urban planning side of it as well? Because
Yes.
it's very noticeable, sort of the American style urban planning model here, with the grids and the wide streets and the very low density.
Yes.
So would there almost be a bigger urban planning effect of integrating Indigenous architecture more, in theory more, than actually an architectural effect?
Both, hopefully, because, as we know, architecture sort of shapes how we do everything from day to day, and urban, as we know, shapes everything we do from day to day. So it's hopeful that it's both. But we are in the middle of a housing crisis, and it's become a sort of like this critical thing now that alternative pathways or alternative ways of thinking about housing that aren't just alternative, they actually do have plausible future focused, or they're future solving or future proofing housing for the next 200 or so years. It's become clear that the old model doesn't really work so well, and that low density now seems sort of it's really noticeable that it's contributed to the housing crisis we see now, and the kind of ideologies associated with that have also contributed to the housing crisis we see now in New Zealand, but arguably the world.
Yeah. Well, that's also the Europeans' fault, isn't it, for exporting it? It is noticeable, though, coming here, just how sort of reliant on cars everybody is, and how there's complete. I mean, obviously, I've come from London, so I've been used to that in the last few years.
Yes.
But it's if you want to get anywhere other than in a car, it's almost impossible.
Yes.
Which seems a bit of an antithesis to what sort of a good community would be like, especially here. So
it is. I think certainly in Auckland and the rural areas, some rural towns are they're really somewhat marginalised by our current transport system because of bus scheduling. And mobility outside of those areas is really difficult, which is, it's saddening to hear that. At an urban level, it appears untenable, that we don't have a kind of something that's comparable to London. But that kind of infrastructure, is a long-term project, and there's been multiple cases of it being sort of picked up and then sort of worked on, and it certainly seems like our current mayor is putting a lot of time and energy into improving public transport, so we're not reliant on cars.
How does sort of the New Zealand architectural world view the rest of the world, or the rest of the architectural world? Does it follow it closely? Does it sort of mirror it, or try to adapt certain things? Like, I've noticed there's a lot of postmodern architecture here, like more so than anywhere else I've ever been, pretty much. And I guess that's reflective of when the building booms were.
Yeah.
So how does the architectural world in New Zealand view the rest of the sort of the architectural world?
Well, I'm but one voice. Speaking on
how do you view it then?
Yeah, how do I view it? Well, I am an Indigenous kind of researcher and practitioner, so I'm very interested in everything the world is doing. I also see myself as a global citizen. I think a lot of us do here, even though we're sort of quite a remote country geographically, but perhaps less remote with kind of Wi-Fi. But yeah, a global citizen, but with, sort of centering my own kind of country, as a citizen as well of this country, and feeling like an active member of its broader communities. Obviously, we think a lot about all the stars overseas and the stars here and what they're making, and I think we're definitely the sort of, I think the pioneering spirit of what it means to be in a country like this. That spirit is kind of always something that looks to learn. So quite interested in learning from architecture over the ditches. We definitely have, we have like a kind of culture where I guess you could call it the brain drain, but it's quite, within New Zealand culture, it's quite, it's almost like a sort of passage, rite of passage that you sort of go over seas and sort of learn for a bit and then come home. And that's still very much, people do that. So I think we're very much aware of what the kind of movements across the world and across the globe, and we feel part of that community. But as well, I think because of this place, I think there's definitely everyone that I know, certainly in practice and sort of working in theory research space, is very interested in what's happening here as well.
Do you think there's a difference in the attitude that architects here have generally to the rest of the world? Are they more, I don't know, more daring and more progressive, or more sort of stuck in their ways and sticking to what they know, or is there a general sort of New Zealander attitude to architecture that differs at all?
I mean, my sense of it is that New Zealanders always have a kind of a can-do attitude about can-do pioneering spirit about their approach, and that certainly doesn't certainly within architecture. The sort of practitioners I see around are very, they're men and women dedicated to the built realm, making spaces that make lives better, and sort of prepared for the hard yakka that takes to do it. So we have some pretty strict regulations, and then we also sort of, to a degree, we're affected by how much it takes to get particular materials here, and those sorts of things as well. So it's not the easiest profession, I'd say, but it's a profession that architects here take very seriously.
Yeah. I've been struck by how few sort of large iconic projects there are around.
Yes.
I guess that's just a reflection of the size of the country, I suppose, in a way, and the small number of cities. And maybe, like you said, the lack of large infrastructure projects. You don't get the big sort of railway stations and airports and all these sorts of great big things. So is that, I don't know, it strikes me as a limiting factor on the ability of Kiwi architects to express themselves effectively, that you are limited to the houses that are being rebuilt, or I guess apartment blocks, a lot of those.
I mean, batch design is kind of a celebrated typology, and a lot, some of the batch design in New Zealand is stunning. It's excellent. And residential spaces and domestic buildings, they're also stunning. So there's a lot of expression in that sector of the industry. So that, and perhaps I should be giving you a map.
Maybe. Well, it did struck me in Christchurch how strange it was having such a high proportion of the place being made out of contemporary architecture that's less than 5 years old, because of the rebuilding, and it lends the place a sort of, I don't know, LA style kind of Beverly Hills, but not necessarily in a good way, kind of a mixture of good way and bad way. It almost feels like parts of it feel like a gated community, in that you've got these sort of large mansions. Again, maybe that's just the urban model.
Yes.
Let's talk about Pacific architecture more generally.
Yes.
What are the sort of key differences? I know you've mentioned the sort of differences in construction method and that kind of thing, but how is there sort of a correlation between the cultural variation around the Pacific and the architectural variation?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, there's an argument to be made that all our kind of architecture comes out of is fit for purpose, and that fit for purpose, the purpose being ceremonial or ritualistic or domestic or programmatic in some way. So I guess that's to say, yes, cultural values shape, value systems shape our built world, and shape the creative practices that inform what is built and what isn't built. Yeah. So yes.
And is there a brain drain as well from the sort of Pacific Islands to New Zealand or to Australia or elsewhere? Is that a problem?
Well, in some ways, yes. In that New Zealand is the second closest to the Pacific, region. The closest architecture school. There's one in Papua New Guinea as well. So, and I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think we're one of I don't think PNG has a planning department either, or urban planning. But arguably, the kind of cities in the Pacific, although they probably they can't compare in terms of population size to say somewhere like London, they're still facing very urban issues and challenges. So you have to train here, and then whether or not after training here, students feel like, or graduates feel like they can return with the same sort of opportunities in the Pacific. There's that's to be kind of considered when we think about the kind of migrating, what the flows look like back and forth. And
does that affect the sort of the flow of values as well? Because if they're coming to New Zealand to train, is that almost clouding their indigenous sets of values to some extent? Even if they did go back, they then might take westernized values back with them rather than using more of their own indigenous values.
I mean, from what I see is no. Those value systems seem to be, from what I see, deeply embedded within identities, specific identities that it appears to me from the students I see that don't seem to, those value systems seem deeply embedded within their own psyche. So what does sort of grow is like sort of sensibility and a kind of architectural knowledge or toolkit that's also informed by our kind of program, as well as the research that's undertaken here, because we're research-led teaching sort of at the university, and then also kind of the canons, the kind of that are considered fundamental to an architecture education. So no, I haven't observed that. From what I've observed, Pacific graduates prioritize their people and communities, and thinking about how to make their lives better through building appears to be very much at the top of their sort of list of things to do once they finish and start practicing.
And is there going back to sort of the practical side of Indigenous architecture and the sort of the patterns and the ornament, that kind of thing, is there another tension there between the largely heavily decorated Indigenous architecture and the sort of more sleek, minimalist, modernist architecture? And how do you sort of deal with that as a lecturer yourself, teaching them? Is it a sort of exploring your own preferences kind of thing, or is there a tension there that you need to get them to resolve between highly ornamented architecture and minimalism? I ask you wearing a very, very patterned dress.
Yeah. Well, I sort of went through architecture education under a few modernists, so I sort of I think a recovering modernist. So I see myself as a recovering modernist with sort of my own kind of Pacific value systems, which, we celebrate colour and craft, detail, and particular things. They're sort of, there was a big attempt to wipe some of those things out during modernism aspects of. So as an educator, though, I think one of the things that I try and sort of let students think about is having a creative process that is critical of that's critical as well as historically aware. I think the Pacific region, from anthropology, across the kind of sciences, and across the kind of various sort of disciplines, has had a history of perhaps Pacific people and culture being studied by people who are not Pacific, and it's sort of being misinterpreted. So I sort of make a case for an education which is rigorous around thinking about history, about our histories, our perspectives, what perspectives are being told, and applying that to the creative process. And I think that, for me, has been more of a priority rather than sort of trying to resolve tensions in form. It's been more about sort of a criticality around the creative process that's historically aware as well as theoretically kind of rigorous. Yeah,
I found it interesting seeing, especially the old 19th century churches. Built, a lot of them obviously fairly traditional, but some of them integrated with Maori architecture and almost being like a hybrid of a meeting house and a kind of whatever it is, Catholic or Protestant church.
Yeah.
Which is a really strange looking thing when you're looking at this thing that you're used to seeing, I don't know, neoclassical or neo-Gothic ornamentation on it, and suddenly it's covered in these beautiful like red and black and strange curving Maori patterns with the figureheads.
Yes.
And that's, like, thinking about that kind of thing, that seems to me the perfect balance of hybridization of the two sides of the culture, which maybe you don't see perhaps in other typologies and in contemporary architecture quite as much.
Yeah, I think, even the question of like cultural appropriation, tokenism, the particular buildings and applications, and they occur in a particular time and a moment. Sometimes when it occurs, it is an expression of where the profession or where the practice was at that time of negotiating two different worldviews or experimenting across worldviews, sort of to use like a kind of term of Dayman Salmon. But it's I think the thing that's really interesting to me is what that might look like for the future. It's a kind of, yes, we have our own kind of regionalist influence on sort of introduced religion and the kind of architecture that came with that religion, but also like what that kind of practice might look like in the future is quite interesting to me too, because it sort of expresses a sort of material, a perspective, a real, a political moment as well, and those sorts of things are all sort of there in motion. So whether or not that's ideal in the future, I'm not sure. But
how do you see it developing in the future?
With more Māori architects, more Pacific architects being at the centre of design processes. Yeah.
As a Samoan, do you ever feel sort of drowned out by the Maori in any way? Because they're they're sort of the obvious and more significant and larger population. But there's all these other Pacific Islander groups that perhaps get ignored because of that.
Well, no, I don't. One, because Māori Indigenous style te Aotearoa New Zealand, so that's one. But then also interestingly, the sort of Samoans are accused of a similar thing by the rest of the Pacific in some ways. They sort of routinely sort of turn to across industry sectors as the Pacific, when actually it's really like differs, like Fiji, Nauru, Tokelau, Marshall. I mean, I could list them all, but the point being that we're often sort of used in lieu of we're used as a sort of example of all, and so I'm kind of keenly aware that there's enough space for all Indigenous practitioners and thinkers and creators and producers, and I don't feel a sort of sense of competitiveness around it.
Yeah, also it's part of that tokenism again, isn't it, that you get mostly well-intentioned people trying to do their best and not really knowing what they're talking about.
Yes, and I mean, we don't, to a degree, I guess we don't occupy the Pacific. It doesn't necessarily, we're sort of routinely regarded as kind of a small, these small islands that are very much peripheral to a global consciousness. So I'm kind of I'm fairly used to that. I don't agree with it.
How big Samoa? What's the population of Samoa?
I don't know. I mean, maybe 300,000.
Oh, right, okay.
Maybe. I could have that quite wrong. I routinely do. I could be mixing that with another country. I'd have to check.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite small, but yeah.
Well, as a rugby fan, I'd argue you have disproportionate influence. But...
Yes. Well, there you go. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, kind of the way we take up a kind of global consciousness is sort of more sporting related rather than perhaps architecturally, or, certainly within the human sciences realm.
Yeah, well, it does, as someone who has been based in London recently, it does seem to me that London and sort of New York and the US do absolutely dominate architectural culture around the world, just in terms of all the media, architectural media and all this kind of thing, and most of the writers and well-known architects as well.
Yeah.
So are there ways, do you think, of better considering a wider group of people architecturally, aren't architects?
Yeah.
I mean, because I asked my friends if they could name a famous New Zealander architect.
Oh, yeah.
No one knows the name of a single New Zealand architect.
Oh, really?
Not one.
That's a shame.
Yeah, so it's I don't know, maybe New Zealand and Pacific Islands need to do a better job themselves of making more noise. Promoting themselves.
I think somebody who most people across internationally will know is Taika Waititi, who's he talks about New Zealanders being terrible at pitching. So maybe that's part of that. Pioneers, but not pitchers.
Possibly. Have you seen Jojo Rabbit yet?
Yes, I have.
What did you think of it?
Yeah, I thought it was great.
It's really good, isn't it?
I'm quite like, it's a very New Zealand, you can really sense the kind of New Zealand humour.
Yeah.
And that this kind of nothing's, a sort of perversity about making what can be made fun of. And I love watching Taika act. He's quite fun.
Yeah.
He's quite fun to watch for me. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a fun guy. It's strange to see so much investment by one country in a very small number of individuals. I guess because you have fewer famous people, or globally famous people from here, that part of their identity, their nationality, gets sort of emphasised so much more. And I guess it's nice to see people like him coming out into the world, but I don't see that with any architects, because you sort of get British architects and American architects going around all over the place, building airports in China and sort of train stations in wherever. But I've never heard of a sort of Kiwi architect building anything outside of New Zealand.
A lot of architects do. Andrew Patterson has a few projects in China, and has been like sort of working there, as well as I believe David Mitchell and Julie Stouder did some planning in China as well. Andrew Barry, I think, may be working internationally as well. Andrew Barry is a professor of design here. So there are, but perhaps again, I also find, I mean, I'm not too sure if this is familiar to you, this sense, but just keeping up with your own country's kind of the profession is a large enough task without thinking more broadly, unless you have like a particular sort of interest in a particular person. So, I think perhaps it's a case of that as well. It's a very busy profession. That's very demanding, and sort of keeping up with practices beyond your own sort of country, and then things that are a little bit closer to you is demanding enough without any other sort of additional information. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I suppose you would have more people going up to sort of China and they're developing stuff there.
Yes, because we are sort of Asia Pacific region.
Yeah, and there's an increasing influence, isn't there, from China and Asia down this way, especially financially.
Yes, particularly in the Pacific, there's a lot of aid from China, and that's really had a great influence and impact on building in Samoa, and various kind of perspectives on that as well. Less so in such a direct way here, but there is a relationship.
Yeah, and is it affecting Auckland or Wellington or New Zealand much in the same way that it is with places like Vancouver, where you've got sort of property speculation and increased house prices and problems for locals because of that? Or is it not really an issue yet?
Not to my knowledge. Sort of issues that we had were sort of internal. They didn't really need external sort of assistance. There was probably some sort of impact, but there's sort of a lot like we have. I mean, in terms of migration, we've got particular migrating, but sort of the housing crisis is affecting people who aren't, it's kind of affecting everyone in a very democratic way, well, sort of undemocratic, really, if we're thinking about it. But no, not to my knowledge. But I'm not an expert actually in that area. It
seems like everywhere has a housing crisis at the moment.
Yeah.
Are there specific causes for it here? Is it just lack of available? Well, you've got plenty of land. I've noticed there's plenty of space, so you're not lacking in land. But is it a regulatory thing? Is it?
It's expensive to build, and we don't get paid so much.
Well, as in the builders don't get paid?
Well, everything costs to build, but whether people can afford what things are. So there's been a lot of inflation over the past 50 or so years. And it's like sort of outpriced everyone, really. It's outpriced everyone for the past decade. I guess it's arguably a neoliberal sort of kind of domino effect that's been set in motion since the 50s or 60s, I guess. It's not really... others might argue differently, but that's my perspective. Yeah,
well, we've got the same problem in the UK as well, and from what I hear, lots of other cities have the same issue with that lack of housing. So, do you think architects have much of an ability to actually help with that problem? Because I hear a lot of architects, especially in the UK, saying, "Oh, we need to do this and we need to do that," but I'm skeptical as to how much we can actually do as design professionals to affect that sort of thing.
I do think we do. I mean, and arguably we have a responsibility to do so. We have a working knowledge of the kind of regulation policies that shape these things, and we also have a working knowledge of how things come together and be put together to like make a house. There's a kind of very practical skill set that can be turned towards such a worthwhile endeavor. I think, and I argue we should, and that we are responsible too. Yeah.
And you mentioned conservation earlier, and about the sort of the young nature of the country, and a lot of 19th century buildings now coming up to sort of, I don't know, milestones of some sort.
Yeah.
Is that something that's I don't know. Is it something that's going to gain more prominence, or are you going to end up re-examining values about what needs to be preserved? Because from my point of view, sort of seeing something that was built in the late 1800s is like seeing something that was built yesterday.
Yeah.
It's very interesting being in a country that doesn't have sort of 2,000 years of history, and suddenly you realise how valuable that is and what it's like. So is there, and does that apply to Indigenous architecture as well? Are there old examples that people are trying to preserve and others want to replace them or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, the region was kind of settled across the whole region 3,000 years ago. So there is that history there. Is it reflected in the kind of Western kind of architectural canon? No. But there is a history there, and a rich oral history that reflects that. In terms of conservation, I mean, this is also another interesting thing. I mean, the kind of study of conservation arguably is a Western construct. So is how it's educated, sort of formulated across everything's only worth saving if it's 2,000 years old. That's an interesting theoretical quandary to find yourself in. I guess I'm not a conservationist, so I don't really have a practical thing to say about it, other than I think it's I think again, this re-examining history is quite an interesting thing to do in a country that had a colonial moment.
Well, it creates a binary where maybe you've got a load of old colonial buildings that get preserved for a long period of time, and then maybe the Indigenous buildings, because they're not subject to that same philosophy, they might get replaced, but then sort of the bureaucratic structures might then not value them as much.
Well, we have this kind of interesting question around, particularly with marae resilience and, marae being subject to conservation law, but sort of a move away, because then you might potentially be subject to different legislation, and then what that means, in terms of like marae resilience, like post Christchurch, thinking about earthquake proofing, and also marae that is on like sort of coastal areas, what a kind of managed retreat might look like, or some sort of climate change management, because there are marae that are subject to rising tides that weren't an issue as recently as 30 years ago, and suddenly water is lapping at the ages of buildings now. So there's definitely a need to think about conservation that is specific to the area, specific to the region and the country, and the country's kind of specific geographical kind of dimensions. I think those are the kind of questions that are a little bit more pressing. I think it might be, well, maybe not pressing, but that are definitely pressing to Indigenous people. Conservation as a managed retreat from climate change versus the kind of conservation of a 19th century sort of building in sort of an urban area. Yeah, I think kind of conservation, this kind of existential threat of climate change is actually like is foregrounded for a lot of Indigenous people and communities in terms of conservation.
Yeah, I suppose in a country with lots of geographical extremes, that you end up getting a sort of faster turnover of buildings as well.
Well, yes, and I can sort of switch to the Pacific region now. Kind of very much at the front line of what climate change means for living day-to-day life. I think the thinking around building conservation takes quite a different tone. So those sorts of challenges are, I'd say, shaping what it means to think about preservation or heritage or culture preservation. It's a which is quite a different angle to think about, whether or not we preserve a thatching or, tiles or something in Auckland.
Yeah. And what are the sort of key questions that are occupying your mind and work at the moment? your sort of academic work?
Well, I'm sort of very interested in healthcare environments. One of my interests is in healthcare environments. Pacific people tend to present later with more further advanced kind of diseases across the board. And I'm interested in sort of cognitive decline and how Pacific elderly are being taken care of with healthcare environments, and thinking about the cultural aspects of what healthcare looks like. For example, like, counters, corridors, within those, or what the kind of whether or not we might think of spaces more holistically in terms of taking care of Pacific people and communities. So that's sort of occupying my mind. Also very interested in how how the regulatory world either includes or excludes people of colour, which is sort of shaped by recent events in the country. And those sorts of things are sort of thinking about how to make spaces more inclusive. Is kind of at the forefront of my sort of interests at present. Yeah.
And all the architectural implications of those, which is a difficult subject because a lot of the time there are none, or it might seem there are none, but actually when you really think about it, there are a lot more. Yes.
Well, I mean, I tend to think that architecture codes what we value as most important in the world. And I guess I argue that I would argue that centering a church, say, for example, and a particular kind of materiality in the centre of Auckland, sort of it signals to kind of the wider society that's the kind of values of the society, and those are the key values to uphold and to live by. And so I guess I'm sort of interested in what that means for people as we move more and more to a more multicultural way of being in this place. And then we also have a historical context that has to be kind of acknowledged meaningfully and respectfully. So it's serious and good work. It's also fun work.
That's the key thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are you supervising any PhDs yet?
No, I'm not actually. We have people contact us, and then I've had some people interested in doctoral supervision, but I haven't. I'm not at present. I'm still actually quite new to this job, so I'm kind of like quite a young academic, although I'm not a young person. So yeah, that's hopefully to come.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun. And by the sounds of it, you've got a lot of people coming through as well that will have some interesting research areas.
Yes, I mean, I'm very excited to see. That's part of what's exciting to be involved in architectural education. It's exciting. It's really exciting to see all these young people coming through and their ideas and things they're thinking about and the way they're thinking about doing it. It's very exciting.
And by going back to where we started with technology.
Oh, yes.
How much adoption of technology is there here? And is it having the effect that people want it to have? Or are we sort of still stuck in the old days of 2D CAD and that kind of thing? Because I come at this from a BIM manager perspective. I used to be a BIM manager.
Right.
So I'm always curious how different places are using technology or not using technology.
Yeah. Okay.
And especially how does that relate to things like Indigenous design? Are people using technology to recreate those sorts of things?
Yes, I mean, there are specialists in this area. VR is becoming more and more of the thing, obviously, and then there's some interest in speeding up the building process, obviously, using VR and BIM. Although because we have quite a different regulatory, it's quite heavy regulation building code here. There's kind of skepticism around whether or not that's actually going to speed up things, or whether it's actually going to give architects more to draw and clarify. So that's one aspect. Digital environments. For example, they're working here with people, I think, from the health sciences school. I can't remember if that's what it's called, but sort of better using VR and kind of the way we think about space as a way of thinking about being able to diagnose particular aspects of like the body. So there's kind of multidisciplinary trajectories that technology is taking architecture, or architecture practice here, or architectural thinking here. So that's one way. And then there's obviously what I mentioned before. And then over at engineering, thinking about post-recovery building. There's kind of an interest in whether or not we can develop, whether we can develop software where you basically can aid post tsunamis or post earthquakes or hurricanes by sending that technology with, like, the idea that, for example, you might be able to send a series of VR headsets and some materials, and that way might be a sort of very quick, a rapid response to rebuild in that kind of, particularly what we were talking about earlier with aspects of climate change and the realities of that in the Pacific. So technology is always going to be of interest to Indigenous communities, and I think Pacific people, a part of our value system is to progress knowledge, and part of our value systems is to be pioneering with that knowledge. So technology is of great interest, and in keeping with what we hold important.
I'd love to see people replicating Maori and Indigenous designs with high technology means.
Oh, you will.
That'd be great.
There'll be examples, and I'll be able to show you at some stage when my memory comes back. But there certainly is, and particularly in the visual arts space as well.
And finally, which film do you think is better, Jojo Rabbit or Hunt for the Wilder People?
Oh no, I'm gonna have to go for Hunt for the Wilder People.
See, I agree with you. I think it's fractionally better.
Yeah, it's like we're down to decimals. Yeah. We're really down to decimals. But yeah, I'm gonna have to go for that film, mostly because of the landscape, actually.
Yeah, that's true. Actually,
I think it's because it takes place in that kind of land. I think because it takes place here, I guess.
Yeah, in the bush rather than...
yeah, and there's that scene with the horse, and Although, of course, Jojo Rabbit was beautiful as well. But,
yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing what he does next.
Yeah, same. Same.
All right, Dr. Karamia Muller, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful talking to you.
Yes,
and
thank you
good luck with all of your research moving forward.
Oh, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Bruce. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you.